Here's how to not get screwed as a landlord in Ontario. Now, to give you some background, I've been a realtor for quite a few years, and if there's a recurring theme I've seen happen time and time again, it is that landlords typically get the short end of the straw. Or is it stick? Regardless, I'll give you guys an example. This last week, we had a hearing with the LTB, and after spending from 8:30 a.m. to 4 p.m., it was adjourned because they didn't have enough time to see our case. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means we get another added 4 months to this. Regardless, it isn't exactly the best process around without the best policies. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through every single thing you need to know as to not getting screwed as a landlord in Ontario. Now, feel free to bookmark this video and watch it over later. It is going to be a longer video, and the idea is to make sure that you are covered on all bases. Now, just a bit of background, I am a realtor, I am not a lawyer, so none of this is legal advice. It is more real estate advice and what we do and the actions we would take in certain situations. So what's the first thing you need to know as a landlord? It is something we call the landlord triangle. So landlord triangle is basically money, law, and people. Now, why do we call this a landlord triangle? Now, this typically applies to many things in life, but specifically to being a landlord, because if you were to not focus on one of these aspects, that is where you will eventually get nailed. Now, when it comes to being a landlord in Ontario, cash flow, believe it or not, is actually optional. It's compliance that isn't. So if you ignore money, you become poor, right? Or house poor in a lot of these situations where all you can afford is the mortgage and nothing else. If you ignore people, you live in constant drama. Now, ideally, you want to stay away from tenants that cause that. And then finally, if you ignore the law, well, you go to jail and you lose quite a bit of money. So you end up losing on everything here. With that said, it isn't a majority of tenants that are causing issues. So if you are a landlord and you're starting to get scared about renting out, believe it or not, most tenants just want to live in peace. It is the bad few, or let's say the uncompliant few, that are causing all the issues. So it shouldn't immediately deter you from being a landlord in Ontario, especially considering the trajectory we're going to be going in the next 5 years. Moving on, let's discuss the rules you're currently playing under. So whenever you hear about laws that govern the landlord and tenant relationship, they're usually under what is called the RTA, which is the Residential Tenancies Act. Now, the Residential Tenancies Act is the act that has most of the laws that govern, again, like I said, landlord to tenant relationships, but the people that enforce this are the Landlord and Tenant Board of Ontario. So the LTB. Now, the LTB you're going to hear quite a bit about in this video and how to interact with them and how to deal with them, because believe it or not, it isn't as straightforward as possible. And sometimes, in fact, a lot of times, it is ideal to hire a legal professional. Now, typically, most cases, you wouldn't hire a lawyer, you'd hire a paralegal. But lawyers tend to be much more knowledgeable and understanding in how to navigate, especially larger settlements. And time again, as I've seen these cases pile up, again, realtor, not a lawyer, but these people do come to us initially for advice before we push them to the lawyers, and it is because they do not have a written out standard lease document. So your standard lease is your lifeline. Make sure you fill it out regardless of who you're renting to. The amount of people I've spoken to that think that they could just pocket the money cash and maybe dodge it on their taxes and not declare it, and then as a result they don't fill out a standard lease, well, you've immediately qualified for squatters' rights at this point. So it's not like you're really running away from much. If you get a negative tenant, let's say, I gotta watch my language because I don't want to lose my license, but if you get a not the best tenant that comes in, you could be liable for quite a bit, especially with squatters' rights. It doesn't take as long as you think. It's 15-20 years and they own the property. So it's not ideal that you get squatters, let's say, so non-paying tenants. If you want to go that route with a CRA, don't recommend it, by the way. So yeah, always have a standard lease written out and just make it clear, make sure the rules are there. And the standard lease is something that should be filled out by the landlord and the tenant together. It isn't something that realtors are meant to fill out. Granted, we sometimes help you, like as a friend, fill out the paperwork, but it isn't the best idea to have someone else fill it out for you. Unless you kind of know what's in there and you just want to get it over with. It's like, hey, can you just input this data for me, which is fine. So, standard lease will cover all bases. Now, believe it or not, the standard lease hasn't changed, but the rules inside it have. And that's kind of one of the beauties of renting in our glorious country is when it comes to the standard lease, for example, I believe it is the pet clause that basically doesn't do anything. They could just say, nope, we don't have pets, and they could bring pets in, and there's nothing you can do. You can't evict them for having pets, you can't do much for having pets, and that's why, as we'll go on, the tenant interview is actually a very important part of the process. Now, keep in mind with the standard lease, if you've agreed to something, you've agreed to something. You know, it's not like, oh, I'm going to agree to it now and just dodge it later. And we have a policy in real estate that we call CYA, and I'm sure it goes against multiple industries, but make sure to always cover your ass. Right? You want to make sure that everything you've done is on record, it's clear, it's clean, and none of this, oh, I trust them and they're not going to hurt me, and oop, you know, and then you get hit at the end of the day. Now let's jump into the fun stuff, landlord math. So when it comes to being a landlord, there's a lot of math you actually have to worry about. Now, like any business, you want to worry about what's called cash flow, right? You want to make sure that the money coming in is more than the money leaving. Now, as a landlord, it is a bit trickier to deal with this stuff, but we can talk about it. So let's talk about what you are paying as a landlord. Let's use red for this because paying is money out. So as a landlord, this is what you're going to be paying. You're going to be paying your mortgage. You're going to be potentially paying condo fees. So I'm going to say condo fees, but this is potential. Now that is if you own a condo, and condos tend to be the best for rent if you're going to be renting them out, outside of maybe 3-bedroom townhomes. But again, conversation for a later time in the video. You got property taxes, which you will definitely be paying. Now, again, a potential is utilities, depending on how you like to negotiate. Now, typically when we're in these negotiations and you get a tenant that negotiates utilities, don't is the best course of action, because when you're negotiating utilities, and we've had this happen in the past, again, against our better judgment, we've advised, but can't really do much beyond that. And what happens is suddenly this tenant ends up racking a $4,000 electricity bill, which does happen, and now you're the one liable for it. So don't do that. And then if you, by the way, let's say they don't pay their rent and you cut off utilities, that's illegal. You can get into a lot of trouble for doing that. So yeah, don't do that. So utilities is a potential, but heavily advised against. And then insurance. Please always have insurance. Like I've heard countless people mention that, oh, insurance isn't mandatory. To have insurance. I don't care if you think it's not mandatory, it definitely is. And make sure the tenant has insurance too. By the way, when you make it a policy to hand over the keys, make sure you see a copy of their insurance policy. Hell, even call the insurance agency and qualify that this is a true policy and these documents are not fake. And now, added benefits is you want something called a maintenance reserve. So let me just write that out. I do have the best handwriting in the world, so please enjoy it. Now, a maintenance reserve is something we will discuss later. It isn't a large amount of money, but it is an important amount of money to have. Beyond that, you have your capital expenditure, so let's call it CapEx, as it is typically called. And then your vacancy reserve. And finally, your time plus management. Okay, so these are the things you need to watch for as a landlord. Now, let's talk about how much they cost, because they are quite expensive. So I know I mentioned all of these things, and now given all of these, you're going to say to yourself, wow, it's really expensive being a landlord. And yes, it is. However, what you want above this is a certain degree of cash flow, which will act as your cushion, and it could also take control of any of these reserves you have right here. With this said, how do you typically calculate rent? Well, rent can be calculated in quite a few ways, and you do need to take into account that when you're calculating rent, what you're trying to go for is profit. However, profit can be tricky as a landlord, especially in Ontario, because rent doesn't typically cover all of these costs. So how do you get into that profit margin? Simply put, the ideal scenario is you don't pay anything out of pocket and you're just renting out this property, and it covers all fees plus some for you to take home and celebrate on Christmas. However, that typically isn't the calculation that goes through. Now, how do we know if a certain property is a good property? Well, just have to clean up the board a bit, but how do we calculate rent? How do we calculate rent as a landlord? Well, there are a few ways to do it. So, ideal scenario is you want to get your fees covered, so we have here, plus some. Okay, so that's like the ideal scenario. It works in some areas in the US. Granted, in the US, being a landlord is quite different, but this is kind of what you want to aim for. However, it's not very possible unless you've bought the property more than, let's say, 5 to 10 years ago. Then this is actually a very doable option. The way you can do this is, so now we can enjoy the songs live. Rent and then some. So this is usually not possible. So what you do is you just go down the road and then you add enough of a margin that you'll be happy doing this, which is usually around 5 to 10%. So some becomes, let's say, 10%. So for example, if you've had a mortgage for, I'm going to say 15 years, odds are your payments are around the $900 range, right? So let's say you're paying $900 a month for your mortgage, which good for you. I hope you're happy. A lot of people now are not. And let's say this is a condo, and your condo fees are probably, if you're doing $900 back then, you're talking about a condo that's quite luxurious now. So let's say, I'm going to say also another 900. Your property tax, probably in that range as well, especially if you're in the GTA and surrounding area. Actually, property tax would probably be in the 600 range. Utilities, don't do it, so 0. Insurance, so insurance does tend to be fairly cheap, especially if it's a condo. So what you want to do here is probably going to be around, I'm going to say $100. And then your maintenance reserve, nothing more than $200 a month, but this could technically, it is a reserve, so odds are you're not going to need that a lot. CapEx, ideally you want around 4K, but this is annual. And then your vacancy reserve is going to be C plus M, so cost plus the amount of months you're willing to leave it empty, which we will calculate. And then your time management, for now, let's just say 0, because again, it is a subjective calculation. Now, with that said, let's get the final numbers. So we're doing 1,800, 2,400, 2,500. So here we have 2,700. Now, odds are for a condo of this cost, let's say, you are going to be renting in the 3,500 range. So this 4,000 becomes 333 a month, which adds to this. So let's say around 3K, which then goes into your 3,500. So to cover your vacancy reserve, you are making an extra $500 a month, and cost-wise, it's actually only costing you this, which goes to 900 plus 900 is 1,800. You got 24, so 2,500. So what you want to have for your vacancy reserve, and it is a reserve, but this reserve you keep when you're not getting a tenant or you build up for it, is basically 5 months profit. So you stack 5 months profits, and then you don't need to keep a vacancy reserve anymore, because that's per month you want to have. Now, with that said, this does tend to be the best calculation for people with older mortgages, and we're talking, again, like I said, 10-15 year range, probably even more. However, this doesn't tend to be most landlords in Ontario, so this is one concept, but it isn't the prevalent one. Now, the next way to do it is what we call the rule of 27. Now, the rule of 27 is not a one-size-fits-all rule. The way it works is whenever you have an investment, which real estate is, it's an investment, and this investment has to give you a certain degree of dividends to make it a qualified investment. Now, with real estate, the reason people kind of get iffy about the number is because when you're paying a mortgage, a lot of that, or a good portion of it, does go towards your principal. So you are gaining a valuable asset here. Now, typically with these assets, is as you build the asset payments, the idea is you want your tenants to pay for that and not yourself out of pocket, which is a fair calculation. But if you have a recent mortgage, especially within the last 5 to 7 years, odds are that isn't exactly possible, especially given the market we are currently in. What you want to do from that standpoint is you want to start planning your trip into something that is more qualified. So ideally, what you want to do in the first 5 to 7 years is get a tenant that has signals of leaving within that 5 to 7 year period, because after they leave, you can now jump up the rent, unless it's not rent controlled, and then that's a different story, which is a good property to have. But a lot of tenants, especially the ones I've worked with, typically immediately look for that, because if you have a good realtor will point out that if you're the tenant, maybe you shouldn't be renting a non-rent controlled, because rent prices are expected to do a little soon, and you don't want to be at the front of that gun when it comes to hit you. So with that said, let's explain the rule of 27. So the rule of 27 is actually fairly straightforward. So you take property value and you divide it by 27, and then you take the answer of this and you divide that by 12 to get your monthly rent. So this gives you annual rent, this gives you monthly. So let's go for it as an example. So let's say you have a property valued at $1 million, because that is fairly common nowadays. You divide that by 27, so you get $37,037. And then if you take that down to, if you divide that by 12, the answer you get is going to be, I think it's around $3,086 a month. Now, all this means, it doesn't necessarily mean if you have $1 million property, this is what you're going to get in rent. No, it means a good middle market rent for a $1 million property in Ontario is around $3,000 a month. Let's say $3,100 for this rate. Now, what would identify then, if you're a landlord and you're trying to buy properties, you would look at rentals in the area, and if they are renting above this number, so the rule of 27, that is a good property to have. If they are renting below, if you are a landlord, stay away. But again, it doesn't mean it's going to be like that forever. You can check city plans or again, this is stuff we typically do as realtors, is we check the background of the area you're looking to buy in, and we make a very educated choice on that matter. And again, this is something we can do together, so feel free to reach out. And this would identify the rule of 27. Now, again, like I mentioned, not everywhere follows this policy because some people just don't know about it. And believe it or not, this is something we were taught. So I was taught this when I was getting my license to become a realtor. So I don't know why many realtors in Ontario ignore it when advising, and I'm not going to speculate because, again, I like my license and I plan to be in this industry for a long time. The final and the best way to calculate rent, which again, these policies you just saw basically tell you how good of a property it is to have if you're going to rent it out and maintain it as an investor. And now finally, let's get into how we realtors actually do the rental calculation. So typically with rent, there are a few things you need to look at. So the two things we looked at before this, they help you understand if this is a good property for rent and if it is a property you can make your money back on. Now the way we do it, and typically you'll hear a lot of realtors say this word, it is what we call a CMA, which stands for comparative market analysis. Now most realtors will give you a CMA. There are 7 varieties of CMAs. They'll do a few and then they'll give you a general calculation. What we do at my team is we actually do all 7 CMAs because there are 7 methods of comparative market analysis. I can explain in a future video. And then we combine them to one mega CMA, let's call it, or just a general CMA. And that is how we calculate rent, and that is how we calculate property value when it comes to negotiations. Because if you go into a negotiation not having a property value in mind, you're going in blind and odds are you're going to get eaten alive. So with that said, let's say we did the CMAs and we found that the average property value in this neighborhood is around $3,000 a month, which is something we actually did quite recently. And to identify the $3,000 a month, we have also identified 3 properties in your neighborhood. So let's call them P1, P2, P3. And these have each rented out at, let's say, $3,000 a month for the sake of numbers. Now, P1, for example, had a 2-car garage. P1 had a single car garage, and this one had a 2-car garage. However, P1 had a finished basement, these had an unfinished basement, and then let's say that P1 was a corner, whereas these were let's say they're all townhouses, because in this case they were, whereas these are just in and in. So the corner unit and then internal unit. Now, it is things like this that you need to look at, and then you can compare yourself to them. So because we have 3 properties that rented in the last 3 months, we can be like, okay, so your property, UP, let's see, your property has a 2-car garage. However, you do also have a finished basement, and then you are an internal unit, right? So you're not a corner unit. Now, with that said, and let's say their square footage is roughly the same, because townhouses tend to range around 200 square feet, which can make a difference in price, but not as much as you can imagine. So again, going back to this, so you have the premium of these, you have the premium of this, and you have the non-premium of this, which means that you have, so this property had a single plus, this property had a single plus, 2 pluses, and this one had a single plus right here. So you have plus, plus, and then no. So which means that because you have one of the 2 pluses that made this property 3 despite having a 1-car garage, which to a lot of people is a deterrent, you can understand that your property is probably going to be slightly higher. Now, when we say slightly higher, odds are you're going to go into the $3,100 to $3,200 range. Now, there is reasons we don't advise to do this, and we'll get into that in just a second, but let me explain this. So let's say we've identified that your property is worth $3,100 a month. Given this little calculation, again, this is something that takes a few hours. It's not something that happens over a few seconds, and that is why it has to be more detailed. But let's say this for the sake of example. We've identified that you've rented for $300 a month. Now, when we went back into the history of it, we actually saw that this one over here rented out for let's have the numbers down here. So let's say this one rented out for $3,100 a month. This one here rented out for $2,900 a month. And then this one here rented out for $3,000 a month. However, this one here rented out 6 months ago. This one here rented out 2 weeks ago. And then this one rented out 3 months ago, which gives you a downward trend in the price. Now, people are going to see that, and realtors, again, if they have a realtor that actually knows what they're talking about, they are going to notice that very quickly, and they're going to try to negotiate you down. So what happens here is they'll see your $3,100, but then they're going to bid probably $2,900. And with that said, you will probably come to a median $3,000 a month, and you're good to go. Now, when it comes to negotiating rent, the last thing you want is a tenant that is going to negotiate $100 with you. Odds are good tenants are more lenient than that. However, they do have a pricing max, and maybe against better judgment, their realtors advise they go to that, which typically isn't the case, but it does happen. And With that said, that is their max and they can't afford a penny more. You also don't want that tenant. And again, this could be a good filtration process for your bad tenants, because if that tenant is so financially tight that they can't afford an added $100, odds are there are going to be some late, if not missed payments. And that kind of explains generally the gist of how to calculate rent. Again, price and rental calculation is its own process and it is fairly complicated, so I will make an added video onto it. Or if you have a house you want to evaluate or a rental price you want to evaluate, if it's fair, we can always talk about that. Moving on from price, if you're a landlord, you probably know what rent control is, but rent control is a very important concept to note. So a lot of people think rent controlled has to be when the property was first built. That is untrue. It is actually when the property was first occupied. So if the property was occupied anytime after November 15th of 2018, it is not rent controlled. It is not under the rent control laws, which basically means that if they're renting for $2K this year, you could make it $3K the next, and no one's going to bat an eye. At least not legally. Your tenants are not going to be very happy. With that said, it is something important to note that, again, tenants will also be looking at this. So if your property was built after 2018, odds are the tenant you're going to get is most likely less experienced, which isn't always a bad thing. And odds are their realtor is also going to be one that, odds are, again, it does happen the other way. Some tenants do just want newer properties, because 2018, believe it or not, is almost 8 years ago. So it has been a while. But if they want newer properties, they're going to be non-rent controlled, and maybe that's a risk they're willing to take, because again, it is a risk, and as a landlord, this could be a very useful tool for you to help move around the properties. So whereas rental increases, for example, 2016 for rent controlled properties was, I believe, 2.1%. And they don't typically go over 2.5% in previous years. So that's not a lot. So if you're doing 1,000, for example, and you've been controlling at the max. So the calculation, for example, is if you've been raising rent as required as the maximum limit that allows you to do over the last 5 years. If you were renting at $3,000 a month, you would now be renting at somewhere within that $3,300 range. Now, with that said, a lot of tenants, like I mentioned, will prefer rent controlled, but let's discuss how to raise rent on a tenant. What happens is you would want to make sure to fill out the correct form, and Landlord and Tenant Board does have these forms on the website. But if you want to raise rent, you have to give them either the N1, depending on your situation, the N1 or the N2. So these forms are typically found on Landlord and Tenant Board's website. Now, if you need help with these, I'll be happy to help you with that. There are guides on my channel on how to fill out these forms if you need to, but again, it is the N1 or the N2 depending on your situation. Now you have to remember, you have to give them 90 days notice, and that tends to be a nice gesture too. Like, it's not just about, oh, this is what's legally obligated. It's more about, look, things have gotten more expensive. I want to be able to cover what I'm paying, and I'm going to be raising rent by, let's say, 2%, or if it's non-rent controlled, 5%, or whatever the amount you need to be. And it can become a negotiation, just FYI, but if you do the 90-day notice, it doesn't have to. Now, here's one that a lot of landlords still surprisingly seem to misrepresent. It is the concept of a deposit. Now, typically when you're filling out the Ontario Standard Lease, so the OSL, you will find a section for a deposit. This deposit cannot be more than 1 month's rent. So if you're renting for $3K, it's gonna be $3K. And that's because that deposit is only allowed to cover the last month's rent. With that said, a lot of people think this deposit is a safety deposit of sorts. No, it is not. And it can't be used as such, by the way. And if you get into an issue with the Landlord and Tenant Board, odds are they'll ask. And they'll say, where is this deposit money? Has it accumulated interest? Which, by the way, we typically have in our documents that it will not. If you check your Schedule B or Schedule C, if you've worked with a realtor that listed your property, odds are they'll have a clause that says this will not accrue interest, it'll be stored wherever. And that is because you want to make sure that you as a landlord don't have to pay annual interest, because if you do store it somewhere where it does accumulate interest, that interest has to be paid out to the tenant. And again, there are certain complexities in that, but just so that you know the law there. So again, your deposit, no more than your last month's rent, and that's what it's there for. It's to cover the last month rent as they're moving out, so they don't pay rent and they're kind of paid in advance. Beyond that deposit is the, for example, key deposit. Now the key deposit, funny enough, I've had people want to ask for $400. That is illegal because it cannot be more than the amount it would take to change that key. So for example, let's say the tenant lost the keys. To replace the average lock, you're looking in the range of $250. So if it's $250 to replace that, that's all you're going to give them. That's all you're going to ask for, and that's all you can request. And then there's also the amount for bounced checks, which I believe is legally stuck at $20 per bounce check. And that is also something the tenant is liable for. Granted, if the tenant's checks are bouncing, good luck getting that money out of them. Otherwise, it's pretty straightforward and it's pretty well outlined in the Ontario Standard Lease document, so you don't really need to struggle that much with it. Again, having an experienced realtor help you with this will make your life so much easier. Moving on, choosing the right tenant. Now, choosing the right tenant is actually not as difficult as people make it out to be. Typically, the red flags will present themselves fairly quickly. However, you do also have to do your due diligence. Funny story, we had a tenant once apply that was a nurse, and imagine calling in the hospital and being like, hey, does she work here, and how long has she been here, and what's her tenure like? So I got screamed at pretty quickly doing that phone call, but at least I was able to confirm that she does work there and she has worked there for quite a few years, so we're good on that front. But again, confirming salary and things of such, even if you do it through email, if it's a nurse at a hospital, you're not going to get a response. Granted, they tend to be good on rent. Now, someone you don't want to rent to is a realtor. Now, let's talk about it. We realtors know exactly what the laws and the rules are, and in no way am I discriminating against certain realtors, but I believe if you're a realtor and you don't own your own real estate, maybe it would be advisable to check other professions. Because, for example, if you've been a realtor even for a year and you don't understand everything you need to know about buying your own property and how easy that could actually be for you to do, odds are you need to explore different avenues. So yeah, unadvisable. At least my clients, I will not ever advise my client to rent to a realtor. So when it comes to advertising your property for rent, odds are there isn't that much of an advertising budget, nor do you really need it to be that much of an advertising budget. So a typical realtor will take that property, toss it on the MLS, and typically that's good enough because people looking for rent that have realtors will see it there. People on apps like Zillow, House Sigma, and all those other brokerages, by the way, do operate in a way that they'll see the listing regardless. So it tends to be on how to make this listing look as good as possible for the cheapest amount of money, because again, the amount a realtor gets paid on rent is not usually the best, and unless this realtor is either A, in need of that rent commission, or B, trying to build a brand, they will very likely not take that on as a task. So with regards to advertising, you just have the MLS, which is the standard database, and then as the realtor fills that out for you, or for them because they're the listing agent, they would check off the area where that allows it to go onto the different websites like Zillow or House Sigma, and then that kind of goes and gets distributed to the world where tenants, even without realtors, will see that property, and it's usually enough. Granted, when it comes to us, what we like to do is a typical few pieces of content that go through the property and kind of give it an overview, sometimes in a comedic sense if the landlord allows it. If not, we go into only the serious note, but they do tend to get quite a few views. I think our top one did get just over 250k views, which is good. They do help convert, and the more eyes you have on your property, the more likely you are to find a good tenant or a good buyer if that's what you're interested in. Again, the 250k one was definitely for a sale, but it's all the same thing. So that's typically it. MLS plus social media is typically where you want to go for rent. Now, when you're auditing, so let's say we've done all this and now you're auditing the tenant that's coming in, there are a lot of things you do need to do. Granted, typically your realtor will help you with these things. However, they legally are the responsibility of the landlord and not the realtor. So the realtor is more of a support as opposed to what the landlord's going to do. Granted, we do help do this. We don't want to just throw you in there water with the sharks and expect you to know how to swim. So we do help quite a bit. Like I said, I'm typically the one that does a lot of the vetting for the tenant. Unless the landlord wants to do it on their own and believes they can do it, go for it. All the power to you. If you need help, I am right here to help you. Now, what you don't want to do when screening a tenant is to get overexcited. Typically that ends in very, very poor results. So just make sure that your excitement levels are maintained into where they need to be. Now, when screening a tenant, the first thing you want to do is look at the requested paperwork. Now, typically when we have a tenant applying, every listing will say, oh, we're only accepting AAA tenants. Now, the thing with that is I had a tenant client that was the best possible tenant someone could have. Very high income, had a track record of 6 landlords they've lived with that all sung their praises. This person was clean, no parties, none of that stuff, professional client, someone I have actually known for I'm gonna say maybe 20 years, maybe 15 years, and a complete just overall perfect tenant you could have. Amazing credit score, no debts whatsoever, made well above the 6-figure range, let's call it. And this person was perfect. Believe it or not, when applying for rent, we did get rejected a few times. And the thing is, I'm trying to say this in a way that I don't lose my license and maintain respect of the realtor community. Now, some realtors, for example, again, I've been indicated who this is, and it's possible for you to figure out who I'm talking about. But for example, we had a landlord that was asking about the SIN numbers for his family members, because occasionally his family members would travel and they might travel and live with him occasionally. And then I talked to my tenant because he really liked the property, but I told him, look, this is typically a red flag. No landlord will go this far. So we did have a think about it, and then I ended up just calling the listing agent, telling him, look, man, these requests are unrealistic. And he's like, oh, if they're unrealistic, then don't work with us. I'm like, we won't work with you. And not to speak about people's intentions, but if your listing agent is making it very difficult for you to get a tenant, it isn't always because they're trying to find the perfect tenant for you. For example, people can have negative intentions, and these negative intentions could be as simple as they know if you don't rent out this property, you're going to be required to sell it, and maybe that's what they're going for, the bigger bonus check, right, or whatever. And that's why it is very important to be cautious in who you hire as your agent, because we do have a legal obligation, a fiduciary obligation, to give you the best possible service that is geared to what you want. However, sad reality is, this is why RICO complaints are a thing, not all realtors will do that. And I think, even speaking about myself, look, if we're not working out, let me know. This relationship isn't working out. I don't see us working together, and that's fine. We can do that. You just sign a document of termination and you're good. But then again, there are reasons where that could be an issue. For example, again, this is a different video for a different day, but vetting your realtor is a very, very important process, which is why we've built our system on integrity. You can speak to all of our clients and they will be very, very happy, and we'd be actually happy to connect you with the flu clients if you need. And that's kind of why it can be a very tricky process when it comes to even selling and buying, or even finding a unit to rent or renting out yours, because you're not just working with the other tenant, you are working with that tenant's realtor, which can be its own little can of worms. Now, with that said, when you're vetting a tenant, you're going to vet salary, you're going to vet credit score. And now, by the way, do your own credit check. Don't depend on the document. It is so easy to fake that document. It is immeasurable. Just do your own credit checks. Criminal history is a good one, and then employment history. But believe it or not, you can check their driver's license records, so their DL. You can check quite a bit. Now, not to give it all away in this video, but you can conduct quite the extensive search on your tenant. Now, the thing is, when doing all these searches, is you do not want to go beyond the human rights code. So, for example, we've had it in the past where the sad reality is not everyone is a good person, and you may be rejected as a tenant or as a landlord, believe it or not, based on things as illegal as race. This does happen quite a bit. Now, there is an argument to be made is, do you want a landlord or do you want a tenant that isn't going to like you based on your race? No. So odds are you dodged a bullet, but it is still illegal nonetheless. And when looking at this, a lot of people tend to be, again, this is where the issues happen, and this is why the LTB is a thing. Don't set minimums. If you feel uneasy, again, always have a tenant interview, by the way. Let me just note that here, because that is like a 10 out of 10 importance. If they do not agree to the interview, that is a huge red flag. Always have an interview. Make sure it's recorded with their approval, of course. Granted, I believe in Ontario, if you're only recording audio, it is a one-party consent law. So as long as you consent, you're fine. Not legal advice. This is just as per public knowledge. But yes, so do the tenant interview. Always do a tenant interview. And based off of that and everything else, because some people could just come off as good people, but we've all known where that can go. Then you make your decision. And that is the best way to currently vet a tenant. And again, you want an experienced realtor to help you with this. Granted, it is your responsibility, technically speaking, to vet the tenant, but some support wouldn't hurt. And the occasional friend in the police wouldn't hurt at all. They could just do a quick search of the name. Not saying that I've done that ever in the past, but just saying it is something. With that said, let's talk about the exact documents you need to request when it comes to this. I'm going to call it your D stack because it's a stack of documents you're going to request. So of course, you're going to go with ID, and 2 pieces of ID wouldn't hurt, but typically people just request driver's license, and that tends to be okay because you can actually check that online for free. So just keep that in mind. If you want an ID, usually your driver's license, and then you want an employment letter, which you will verify, by the way. And then you want pay stubs. Now, if they are self-employed, a simple bank account verification would be sufficient usually, but you do want to see their pay stubs or how they get paid, contracts they've had. Self-employed people do have their own. I would hesitate from giving people without pay stubs because odds are something fishy is going on there and you do not want to be a part of that, especially people with CRH. And then finally, you want their SIN number because you want to conduct a credit check. So an important note about the credit check is you are not just checking their credit score. You're going to go into that credit report and you are going to dissect it and see what kind of spending and borrowing patterns they might have. Because if they are someone, for example, that you identify that buys a new car every 2 to 3 years, you want to make sure you're at least aware of that and when they bought their last car. Because again, when they pull out loans and then they think they can pay them off and they can't, guess who's going to suffer? You are. And this is a part of the rental application as well. All of these tend to be, but you want to check rental history. Now, be warned. Some previous landlords will not be telling you the truth unless it isn't. Let me explain this. For example, if in their rental history they've only had one landlord and you call that landlord and they say, yeah, they're amazing, you should definitely rent to them. Oh my God, they are the best. And that landlord is their current landlord. Believe it or not, odds are they are not telling the truth. And that is because if their current landlord is complimenting them so much that it's just beyond this world, odds are they want to get rid of them. And that does happen. And the sad reality is I've worked with people that have done that in the past. Granted, I don't advise doing that at all because you could be held liable for lying and telling the other guy, yeah, he's perfect, especially if they have that call recorded. Again, like I mentioned, audio recordings, this is a single party consent state, technically, province. So just keep that in mind when those phone calls come in, because last thing you want to do is get sued. So rental history plus calls. And then let's talk about their references. Now, typically, people will not put a name in their references unless they know that person will be speaking positively again. If you call their references and they do not pick up, request new references. Don't just leave it as is. I don't care how time crunched you think you are, request new references. Make sure you talk to people. You need to talk to at least, at bare minimum, their employer, their past landlords, and 2 more references. Just call them, ask, verify that these are real people and that they are good people to deal with. And again, always speak to a lawyer, but consider recording your calls. And then after all of that, plus the tenant interview, like I mentioned previously, then and only then can you make your decision. Keep that in mind, save this, bookmark it, do whatever you want, but make sure what you do when you get a tenant is you check their IDs, you check their employment history and actually make the calls. You get their pay stubs and you actually verify them. You get their SIN number and credit check. And by the way, you verify them with bank documents, so bank history. You get their rental history, you make the calls to the landlords, you get their references, and then you do the tenant interview. And only then do you make your decision, unless you want to get screwed in this province. Moving on, let's talk about the Ontario Standard Lease. Now, the Ontario Standard Lease is a document that if you are a landlord, you should know very, very well. Let me explain. So in the document, there are many clauses, and I'll have a video about this in a future date on how to fill it out and what each clause means, but just to give you an understanding of how it works. So the Ontario Standard Lease outlines all of your obligations with you as a landlord and the tenant, only the ones that are required under law. Why is this important? Because if you go to the very bottom of the Ontario Standard Lease, you can actually add your own clauses, which is typically advised. Now, however, just a side note, if you are doing this on your own and don't have a realtor, make sure that you have the tenant initial every single clause to ensure that they read it, because the legal trap of that could get quite messy. And again, this is more of a lawyer's duty, so it's not me as a realtor, but I'm just telling you what we see and what happens in our profession. Among the clauses within the Ontario Standard Lease, you're going to get the utilities clause. And on the Ontario Standard Lease, they make it very easy. So with utilities, it outlines very clearly, like, you guys just check who does what and you're good on that front. So as a landlord, again, like we mentioned, do not cover any utilities unless you're the one paying for the condo fees and the condo fees pay for the utilities. Whereas it's not you that's going to get punched, it's the condo corporation. So just keep that in mind. So only if the condo is, and only for the ones the condo pay for. Now, so most condo corporations only pay for 2 out of 3. So make sure you run it by a good realtor, or if it's legal, you need to run it by a lawyer. Just make sure you do that right. Moving on, the Ontario Ontario Standard Lease does outline a few other things. So for example, pets. As of the recent rule changes, you can no longer discriminate against a tenant for having pets. And now I understand the argument for not wanting pets in your home, especially as a landlord, because certain sized pets could be an issue. Now, some of these are actually covered by, again, if you live in a condo, they're covered by the rules of your condo corporation. Make sure you give the tenant a copy of the condo corporation rules. If you do not, that is a claim against you and not for you. So for example, if your condo corporation allows dogs up to a certain size, that is the maximum allowable size that they will have to abide by, FYI. So that is the rule for pets. Now pets, again, they could say no and bring a pet and there's nothing you can do about it. You can thank the LTB for that one. Moving on, we have smoking rules. Now smoking is an interesting one because it does vary on the rules. So if you are a landlord and you allow smoking, I would first ask you why, but most landlords we work with, actually I think all that we've worked with, don't allow smoking. Now when you say no smoking, you can say no smoking in different ways. Usually what you'll get is no smoking in the premises, outside is fine. However, depending on the kind of unit, and again depending on the condo corporation rules, sometimes smoking isn't allowed even around a certain unit. So for example, if you're a condo and you have a balcony, smoking could be illegal in that balcony, believe it or not. And then if you're a tenant that smokes, that's something to look at, but again, this is a video strictly for landlords. So that's the topic of smoking. You want to make sure that you have that covered. And the best way to do it is, again, we have pre-drafted clauses from our lawyers that we use for these kinds of things, but we typically say not on premises and not near the premises. And then near, I think it gets identified as within 10 meters of the premises. So that's one for you. So nowhere near the premises. And again, excuse my handwriting. And then when it comes to maintenance reporting, so when you are a landlord and on the Ontario Standard Lease, you'll have to give them an address where they can send you notices, and it is ideal to give them your email address so that they can reach out, or a phone number, depending on the relationship you want to have with your tenants. Ideally, you want to get close enough where they're comfortable telling you what's wrong, because the last thing you want to find out is, oh, you need a new furnace, because they were shy, scared, hesitant in any way, shape, or form of letting you know of certain things that could have been repaired, but now because these things were not repaired, you now need to get a new furnace, and the new furnace is going to cost you a bunch of money, and you're not ready for that because you didn't have a maintenance reserve like we advised earlier in this video. So that's something you want to keep in mind, that look, if something needs fixing, please let me know. Unless it's like a light bulb or something you can do on your own, don't do it. Let me know, or we'll do it together and we'll talk about it. So that covers for maintenance. And then another important one is how the rent will be paid. Typically, what we get is post-dated checks. And post-dated checks, this means they give you a check for each day of the month. And that tends to be the thing that puts landlords at ease. So the actually, I'm just going to call it payment. There are a few things to note, is that just because they gave you a post-dated check doesn't mean that check isn't going to bounce. So like, yeah, I could give you $1 billion of checks. Doesn't mean anything. Those checks are going to bounce and you're going to be the one paying for them unless you sue them and you go to the landlord and tenant board, because that is outlined in the clauses that they have to pay for any bounced check. But good luck suing them for 20 bucks. So the thing that happens there is post-dated checks are nice. E-transfers are also an option, but what I don't recommend is cash for two reasons. One, if they are a tenant and they agree to pay you in cash, something's wrong, because tenants do get a tax deduction for the amount of rent they pay. So it is not in their best interest to pay cash. And if your tenant is paying cash, odds are something else is happening in that residence that you do not want to be a part of, because the last thing you want is a crime to be committed on your premises, and that is going to devalue your property and it's going to give you a whole bunch of issues. So don't do cash. Granted, it is an option, but a very, very bad option. Another reason you don't want to do cash is squatters' rights. So squatters' rights is its own issue, and I need a lawyer on the video to kind of walk you through the guidelines of it. But the reason you don't want to do that is because if they can identify as squatters and they stay there for quite a long time, they could just take the property. That is how Ontario housing laws work, and you don't want to do that. Granted, I think it's 15 years before they can do something like that, but don't do it. Just don't. Evicting squatters is very, very difficult in Ontario. Hopefully it's going to get better. We've been talking to a few ministers regarding that, but yeah, don't do it. Don't do it. Now, there are other issues that your Ontario Standard Lease covers. With that said, the OSL does have a few other topics it needs to cover. And again, we'll have these covered in a future video that will be uploading very soon, but it outlines each category and what to fill out in that respect. For example, one of them is parking. Parking, you just need to identify exactly, and I mean using legal terminology, run it by a lawyer if you need to, or we have standard clauses for that kind of thing. But make sure you identify the legal terminology for the kind of garage you have, because if you fall short of anything in the Ontario standard lease, you could be held liable. And it could just be as simple as you didn't know how to explain a certain thing, like where their parking is. If it's underground, if it's above ground, if it's in the building, it's one spot and the spot's name is 123. Like if you're living in a condo and let's say it's like E74, you have to say the parking spot identified within the condo as E74. Be very, very, very specific in your language. And you do not want to be vague enough that they can interpret it as something else and claim it was interpreted as something else and then withhold rent from you because you're not upholding your side of the bargain, so to say. Now moving on, let's say you filled out the Ontario standard lease and it's all signed and everyone's happy. Time to move in. At least for the tenant, not for you. When it comes to move-in date, what we always recommend, and typically this is something we do as a realtor, because again, we want to make sure you're covered on all bases, is we make a move-in video. Now, this is amazing as a video. Just make sure in this video you aren't just running through the property and that you are going into every room and slowly panning over the walls, because if there is damage to the property, you are going to have to prove that that damage was not there on the day they moved in, because they could claim it was, and if you don't have any counter evidence, that claim could actually be held up in court, believe it or not. Welcome to Ontario. Now, make sure you make that move-in video. Again, this is something we typically help you with. We just do a full rundown of the property. You can even have the tenant with you there in the video as you make that quick rundown video, but make sure that you sift through everything in the property that could be damaged. Now, when it comes to the video, it would be good to show a date stamp, for example, opening any news company's website and just refreshing it actively and showing it on video that this is the date, December 12th, 1975, whatever the date of your move-in is. Probably not in the 1900s anymore, but again, you get the point. So that is something you need to do if on the move-in day. Beyond that, you need to also have a document ready, ideally, that states that they have received everything in working order. Now, typically, this is something that is more upheld by their realtor, that you can send to their realtor and their realtor will send to them to fill out and to sign, but to make sure that they've checked every appliance and everything is in working order, so any future damage would be caused by them and not by you. And again, this is a best practice as well for when you're selling a property, FYI, but here we're only talking to landlords right now, and when buying it. So that covers the appliance check. Moving on, it generally doesn't hurt to have a written checklist of everything they need when they move. So you gave them the keys, you make sure you sign a document that says they did, ideally electronic signature, because it locks in like your IP addresses and it can be tracked like that. But sign that you gave them the keys. Make sure you've collected from them the documents you requested. Make sure you have their utilities proof, right? That they've actually transferred the utilities to their name and you're not going to be the one paying. Make sure you have their key deposit. Of course, your other deposit you would have already received with the offer, so you'll be fine on that front. Make sure you've given them the complete outline of garbage rules, condo rules, if you live in a condo. And then what would happen is you would give them a card or something to stick on the fridge or wherever they want to stick it that tells them who to contact in case repairs are needed. If it's not you, if you have like a handyman you work with or someone of the sort, and when to contact this person if there are specific hours to do so. And then finally, when the move-in is completed, and this is something your listing agent would most likely be the one to do, but you would send a summary document through email. It's like, hey, today this was the move-in. I just wanted to outline what happened. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You've given this, you've signed this, you've done that. Because if they don't deny it then and there, they cannot deny it in the future. If they do deny it, well, you're in for some fun. Now let's bring in the topic of repairs. So, in Ontario, the landlord is obligated to keep the unit of residence in good and livable condition. So what does livable mean? Now, it is a slightly vague legal definition, and I won't act like I'm a lawyer because I am not, and nor do I intend to be, but livable. Now, what does a unit need to have for it to have a livable status? Well, when it comes, for example, to water, of course, it needs to have water in the unit. Plus, it needs to have access to hot and cold water, because otherwise it wouldn't be considered livable. It needs to have fuel. So if this is like a gas, which is what most residents are now, granted, there are some that use propane or some that use more different fuels, whether it be wood, if your unit is that old. You want to make sure that you have whatever fuel. You want to make sure it has access to electricity. And again, this is why you have the tenant pay the electricity bill, because if it gets cut off because they haven't paid, this isn't your fault. They still have access to electricity. Now gas, whether it be natural gas or propane, and then access to heating. Now here's a tricky one for you. Some condo corporations delay when they turn on their heating to save money. Granted, you could be legally liable to this, potentially. And again, it's more of a nuance to speak with a lawyer about, but that is something that does happen. Now, when it comes to heat, what does it mean for a property to have heat? Believe it or not, there is actually a temperature for this. It is 20 degrees Celsius. So if you can maintain the property above 20 degrees Celsius, this property has access to heat. Now, how that heating is done isn't exactly the concern. It's just that they can get the property to this price. So for those of us that grew up in the 80s and 90s, you would remember that if you moved the thermostat above 21, you're probably going to get an earful from your father. Now, what you also will hear about when it comes to Ontario livability is what they call suitable for habitation, which means that if repairs need to be done, for example, a window breaks in the winter and the tenant says it's your job to fix, you say it's a tenant's job to fix, you might need to fix that window and then sue them for it later. Because if that window is broken and that cold air is coming in, you've technically lost the habitability of that property, which they could use to withhold rent. And legally speaking, of course, they can withhold rent for the duration of that inhabitability period. Now, if you want to be very technical about what your requirements are as a landlord, there is the Ontario Regulation 51706, which outlines the requirements of your maintenance as a landlord in Ontario. I actually believe it's general property maintenance, but again, this is the one you want to look at. Ontario Regulation 51706, if you want to be technical about it. And now when it comes to water, let's talk about sewage. In a nutshell, your sewage system has to be free from any defects, meaning any leaks, any blockages, or any general defects, let's say. And then there's also it's a more housing standard, but your pipes have to be protected from freezing. Odds are, if you're a landlord, you know that, and your property is protected, because if the property is over a year old in this country, it's definitely run down that path. So sewage is a crucial one for you. Now, here's another one for landlords. A lot of landlords tend to bootstrap their basement renovations or any renovations in general, which in the most part is fine in Ontario. However, make sure that if you add any switches to your electrical box, that these are approved by a certified electrician. The reason for that is when something happens to your house, and it could be a true story. We had a client that had flooding in their property. The first thing the insurance people did when they came to see the property is they went to the electrical box, even though this was flooding. It had nothing to do with the electrical box. But the reason they checked is if there were any switches in that box that were not done by a certified electrician, congratulations, you've just voided your policy, and they don't even need to cover you for the flooding that just happened. So just make sure you're very wary of these things and what can void your insurance policies, because it is in insurance's best interest not to give you any money, and they will do their best not to do that. So keep that in mind when you're doing these things, and make sure a certified electrician is the one doing any major repairs. Granted, changing light fixtures is not one of those, believe it or not. However, certain degrees, landlords in Ontario are allowed to make those changes in their own properties. Well, who's not allowed to do it is someone who isn't the landlord or isn't a certified electrician. Otherwise, they could be liable. And then finally, to make it habitable, you do have to have like structural security and safety so the house isn't falling apart, which is pretty common sense. No one's going to rent a house that's falling apart unless they're trying to start their own little meth lab in the basement. And the final one, believe it or not, are pest control. And pest control doesn't necessarily just mean mice. You may get the occasional tenant that doesn't exactly care about sanitation, and it does happen. And you could get a mouse problem in the house. So a mouse problem in the home could be very expensive to remediate or fix, let's say. And the reason for that is pest control would have to do quite a few things to ensure that your house is mouse empty, but it's not just about mice. For example, there are outbreaks that happen in people's homes that could be very destructive and very costly. They could come in the form of a weevil. And weevils can get quite violent in homes. You can also get termites, but weevils will more destroy food. Termites will more destroy your foundation and your actual property, which can be very expensive to remediate. But make sure you have these locked down, and make sure to walk your tenant through how to not have these things happen. Again, most tenants don't have experience with home ownership unless something has gone horribly wrong. So just keep that in mind, that you want to make sure your tenant is aware of these things and how to stay away from them. And if they are a good tenant, they will make sure that none of these things happen. And that would cover the the maintenance portion of this episode. So moving on, we have the entrance requirements as to when you are a landlord. So when you're a landlord and you want to come in and see the property, immediately you need to give them at least a 24-hour notice. Now, this doesn't mean every other day give them a 24-hour notice and be like, hey, I'm going to be there, I'm going to see the property. It's not the best thing to do. However, I have seen this be used as a trick to serve a tenant with a legal document, because technically if you go in and they're there, you just hand it to them and you've been served. Congratulations. And this is the end notices, which we will discuss in a bit, but that does tend to be a requirement of entering the home. Don't give them those 4-hour notices. If they're not legally savvy, they're just going to be mad, and if they are, it's going to be even worse. However, important note, you can technically enter the property very quickly if it is an emergency, but keep in mind it is the burden on you to prove that this was in fact an emergency. And the definition of emergency, although can be vague at times, it is if it's life or death or a couple $100,000 in damages, emergency. If it's something that could be remediated for $1,000, let's say, I don't know if I would identify that as an emergency. And typically it's actually up to the adjudicator to decide what an emergency is and what it is not. And finally, there is the rule of something we call quiet enjoyment. Quiet enjoyment means they do have a right to a peaceful home. Believe it or not, even though some homes aren't exactly the most peaceful, they have the right to try. And then finally, let's talk about safety regulations. So there was actually a new regulation as of this year, 2026, that required more carbon monoxide alarms in the rooms. With that said, make sure you're compliant. Granted, this could be a simple call to the fire station, say, look, this is what I have, is this compliant? And they can even come and check them for you. That is something that is typically recommended every 6 months to a year, where they can just come in, make sure your fire alarm system is working fine, and they'll leave. And this way you've kind of protected your home and the asset that you're building towards owning. Now, it does happen, but less common these days. Those who don't worry about, or landlords that don't really account for safety compliance, all they're really scared of is a fine. However, the true side of that is a fine is the least of your worries. If your house is proven non-safety compliant, something was to happen, God forbid, someone was to lose a life, that's on your head now. And now it's your job to pay it off or even potentially go to prison. So keep that in mind, that safety isn't a joke. And if they can prove that you had an unsafe practice or an unsafe living condition that you are aware of, expect something much worse than a fine. Moving on, let's talk about the landlord and tenant board forms. So when you're working with the LTB, there are notices and then there are applications. So first off, when you have an issue with a tenant or a tenant has an issue with you, they give you a notice. So under the LTB, there are the N forms, which there are tutorials for on my channel. Feel free to use those. But the instructions on the LTB are pretty clear and straightforward. With that said, so for the N forms, you have the forms, they go from number 1 all the way to number 15. So let's just write those out. Starting off, for most landlords, if you want to raise rent, you will be using an N1. Now an N1 is fairly straightforward. It's just kind of letting the tenant know that we're going to be raising this rent, this amount, because of rent control. So this applies only to rent controlled properties. You use the N2 for also raising your rent. So if it's exempt, you would use the N2 form. Now this is again for like things that are rent controlled properties or other properties of the such. Now number 3 is more for care services. So you want to raise rent for care services or even meals, like again, care home or whatever it might be. So this is the form you would use. Granted, 99% of you will not need to see this form ever. The N4 is the most commonly used form, and it is the one for end tenancy. So moving on, the next forms are going to be ending tenancy, but this one is going to be ending tenancy because of non-payment. So this one is a very commonly used one. Again, the guide for how to fill it out, I have one on my channel, but the LTB does outline the steps quite clearly if you'd like to read their guide as well. Now, the N5 is more about being a general nuisance. Now, if they are interfering with others' enjoyment of the properties or habitability, you would file an N5, or if they're even damaging the properties. So I'm going to say interference and damage. And again, this is minute damage. If the damage gets more extreme, that's when you go into the N7. So that's when you get into the N7 territory. But that's kind of where the N5 is. And usually you want to, if you don't know which one to do, you have multiple courses of action. You could just do both and then apply for both in the LTB and see whichever one the LTB tells you is correct. But I would advise hiring a lawyer or paralegal to help you with this, because sometimes navigating can be fairly tricky. But typically, if you're okay with reading the instructions, you could do it on your own. Now, if they're committing illegal acts or like drug selling or any other form of selling in the property that is illegal, that would be for N6. Again, I would I would advise consulting a lawyer for this one, because you want to make sure you're protected too, because if they figure out you've identified that they're committing illegal acts, I'm not sure they're going to be very receptive to an N6. Moving on, we have the N8. Now, the N8 isn't a commonly used form. It's more to end the tenancy at term. So EDAT, so end the tenancy at term. And that's more for something like, for example, they had a work contract that ended, and you're just gonna be like, okay, when your work contract ends, your tenancy ends too. It's a fairly straightforward form. It's one of the lighter ones, I would say, but it's not a very commonly used one because not a lot of people fit into that quota. Moving on, we have the N9. Now, the N9 isn't a notice you give to the tenant. It's a notice that the tenant gives you. So the tenant wants to leave, and it's just a generic document like that on what date and things of that sort. Beyond that, we have the N10. Now, the N10 is not one that, again, a lot of people are going to see, but if you want to raise rent over guidelines and you're among the restricted folks here, you would use the N10 because you want to do so. It's a rent increase above guidelines, and again, very difficult to enforce. N11 is one that's signed in agreement, so it is you and the tenant agree that the tenancy will end on this date. It is a very easy one to enforce. You kind of just go and you get an order and then you evict them. The N12 is one where you need it for personal use or sale. Now, a bit of a nuance here. When we say sale, it doesn't mean you listed the property for sale. It means you have a firm offer and the person is going to take possession of the property. Granted, you have to give them at least 2 months notice, and if you give them 2 months, you have to pay them a month of cash. But if you don't give them 2 months notice and you give them 4, I believe you don't have to pay them anything. Granted, not easy to get someone to leave for free. The N13 is if you're doing any demos or major renos. So that would be the one you would use in that respect. And again, remember, N13 doesn't necessarily mean that you will not be liable to anything, because if they don't take it and then they can take you to court, you would still be liable for the rent they paid during that period. And then moving on, 14 would be so 14 and 15 are, hopefully 15 you'll never have to see. But the 14 is more used to a spouse of a tenant who already left to get them to leave as well. So like if a spouse and wife, like a husband and wife, they're on the lease and the husband leaves, you could tell the wife, okay, you got to leave too now. So spouse notice. And then 15 is one that the tenant gives you for fear of, let's call it SA and harm, or like domestic harm. If the tenant is in that situation, let them go. Legally, technically, you have your rights, and I understand that. But if they're in a genuinely dangerous situation, A, get the police involved immediately. B, let them go. Like, let them be safe. I understand that a tenant leaving and then not paying could be an issue, and oh, I can't afford my mortgage. This is worse. So I don't, it goes to show, like it goes to say, it's not a complicated concept to cover, but yeah, just let them go. Granted, thank God, it is a very rare occurrence. So now you gave the tenant an end notice and they haven't left for any reason at all. So you go to the landlord and tenant board given the period for each notice. Now the N4 is finally at a 7-day notice period. You can submit what is called an L application. So you have the L1 all the way to the L10. The L1 is if you give them the N4 and they don't leave, you give them the L1. It's a fairly standard application. They're saying it takes only 3 months now. Not sure I believe that, but that is what we're told. So if they don't pay, you go court. The L2 is one you use for it's also if you give them an N5, 6, 7, 8, 12, and 13 form. So any of these forms, you give it to them and they don't leave, you can file an L2. So the damage, the illegal acts, the end of your term documents, the agreement to leave, and then the personal use, and the demo and the reno. Which, by the way, goes to court quite a bit when it comes to demo and renovations. So the L3 is probably the easiest one to kind of get ruled. It is when the tenant gives you notice that they want to leave but then doesn't, or you do the N11. So that is the N9 or 11, and they don't leave, you would just use the L3 application. Now, sometimes you fill out these and you go to court, and then they get an order to remediate, fix, or pay for whatever damages they caused, but they get to continue their tenancy. This would give you the L4. So if they don't follow these rules and they stay in the residence, it's to evict after an order. And again, not a very common occurrence unless you rent to a realtor, which you should never do. Just joking, Rico. Don't sue me. Now the L5 is one that isn't looked at very lightly, but it is it's the application to raise rent above guidelines if the tenant says no. which they probably will. No tenant's like, yeah, here, take my money. So raise rent above guidelines, which you can apply for, because in certain situations it does make sense. Like, there are people that still have $500 rents, and they're just kind of banking on it, and the property tax of those units is probably higher because they've been living there for like 50 years. Now, the L6 is, I believe, a provincial work order, so it's one I've never seen before, so their application, so probably something you're never going to come by. If you do, get a lawyer, right? It's always, with these things that are very nuanced, lawyer is your best bet, or a paralegal at least. Now, if you have someone you want to transfer care of to, for example, care homes, you use the L7. Again, not one 99.9% of you will ever be using. Now, an L8 is an interesting one. If the tenant leaves and they change the locks, that's what you go. Or even if they're still there. But lock change. But it is a very specific one. It is just the dumbest situation that you can have. And then L9 is to collect rent a tenant owes. So kind of like rent arrears. And then 10 is to collect rent as well, but from a tenant that has left. Now, typically the L9 is used if you don't want to evict them, because the L1 would require eviction. L9 is to collect rent without evicting. L10 if they left without paying. So it's a fairly straightforward process when it comes to the L forms. So with all of that said, and hopefully you learned quite a bit in this video, if you are a landlord or you're looking to become a landlord and you want to list a property, or you're looking to buy profitable renting properties, feel free to reach out. Our team has been in the space for quite a few years now, and we've been working quite successfully with this regard. So if you want to just do a home evaluation, or if you want to go a little further, feel free to give us a call. My number is in the description. I look forward to hearing from you, and have a wonderful day. Bye now.